And thank you for reporting. It's important to remember this is not just a U.S. issue. In the U.K., there's an ongoing debate over what to do with statues honoring people tied to slavery. Protesters are asking for at least 60 monuments with links to racism to be removed across the U.K. NBC's Helena Humphrey is in London. Helena, what kind of opposition is there to removing these statues?
Hi there, Alicia. Well, talking about opposition, just take a look at the violent scenes from this weekend here in London. Yesterday, Saturday, we saw hundreds of far-right demonstrators descend on the British capital. They say to protect the statue to Sir Winston Churchill after it was defaced, after it was tagged with graffiti saying Winston Churchill was a racist, taking aim at his record of racist comments, his staunch defence of the British Empire. And then what we saw were these violent clashes ensuing between the far-right protesters and between riot police. 6 police officers were injured, and we also saw this incredible moment of a Black Lives Matter protester coming out and then seemingly carrying to safety one of the far-right protesters who had been injured in those clashes. But the galvanizing moment that sparked the ire of the far-right was the events from Bristol the previous weekend, when we saw the toppling of the statue to the 17th century slave trader Edward Colston. It was then rolled into the harbour. Now, it has since been taken out of the water, and you ask about, what to do with these statues. It will be put in a museum. But certainly we then saw something of a domino effect across the country. We saw protests at the University of Oxford calling for the removal of the statue to the Victorian imperialist Cecil Rhodes. Here on the banks of the River Thames, we saw the removal by local authorities of a statue to the 19th century slave trader Robert Milligan, lifting from its plinth to scenes of cheering crowds here in London. But we do now have an official statement from the government here, from the Culture Minister, who writes that further removal of controversial figures, he says, would be the airbrushing of history. Now, I've been speaking to various historians about this, and in fact they say the removal of statues is nothing new. Take a listen to what Professor David Olusoga from the University of Manchester had to say.
The history of removing statues is as long as statues themselves. The idea that statues are permanent, that they're not moved or they're not replaced because societies move and change their ideas, that's a very strange idea that seems to have been confected in the last few years. It's normal when societies change for them to reassess the statues that they have.
Now, chiming with that, we've also heard from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and he says, in terms of where do we go from here, he says that new statues must be erected here in London to reflect the diversity of the city, to celebrate people of colour, for example, who have made such a contribution to this city, talking, for example, about people from the Windrush generation, people who came from the Caribbean in the wake of the Second World War and were so vital to the rebuilding of this nation. Alicia?
Thanks, Helena. Protesters in Seattle are getting a lot of attention for establishing what they call an autonomous zone. But that's not